It's the Progress Pod, a production of the Franklin County Coalition for Progress. I'm Pete Mazzoni with Jeremy Cate. October is LGBTQ History Month, and our guest on this week's podcast is someone with a pretty good grasp of that history, as well as where we stand today. Dr. Jayleen Galarza is Associate Professor of Social Work and the co-chair of Shippensburg University's LGBTQ+ Concerns Committee. She's also a member of the Board of Directors for the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania, among many other roles. Her research and practice is firmly rooted in her passion for sexuality, social justice, and we're glad to have her here with us today. Thank you for coming on the show, Dr. Galarza.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start out with talking about what LGBTQ History Month means to you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So this month really means quite a lot for me on a personal and a professional level, actually.
I'm sure.
On the personal level, I have been out as a queer person of color for, I was calculating this the other day, I think 17, 18 years. So it's been quite some time in my own journey and coming out process. And so for me, LGBTQ plus History Month is not just October, it's every day of the year, 365 days of the year. Right. And so it's very personal to me, professionally as well, because I've pretty much dedicated my whole life, my work, to supporting the efforts towards equity, equality, and inclusion. And so I think this month really helps us to highlight some of the challenges, but also the resiliency of our communities.
And so that takes you back to what, about 2001 when you came out?
Yeah, 2001, yeah.
And so how did it go for you?
How did it go for me? Actually, pretty decent, I think. In terms, coming out for folks who aren't as familiar is an ongoing process. So you never just come out one time. And so the first layer for me was a couple of friends at school, not necessarily on purpose, kind of by accident coming out. That went okay. And then came out to my mother, and that went really well. She's super supportive. She always has been. And I would say, compared to many folks in our communities, I think I had a pretty good experience. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you have any mentors or people you looked up to?
So, interestingly enough, what I had was where I did high school at that time was Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and there wasn't a lot of support, but there was a new youth group, LGBT youth group, that's actually still around. It had only been around for like a year at that point, and there was a teacher at my high school who connected me with that youth group. She would volunteer facilitating that. It was at a Unitarian Universalist church. And that was really great in terms of supporting me in my process, that youth group. Besides that, I didn't know a lot of queer folks. I didn't have a lot of people to look up to except for what I could kind of get my hands on in terms of media at that time. There was not a lot of social media presence. So music, musicians, so that was my main kind of modeling that I had.
And so now, having gone through that experience and working with young people, what are you seeing? What's going on out there? What are the concerns, the fears? How are you kind of paying it forward, you might say?
Yeah. So I think the concerns and fears, unfortunately, are very similar. Not much has changed. We've seen big changes overall, of course. Everyone points to marriage equality, right? That's definitely something that at that point in time I was like, oh, that'll never happen. I didn't even think that happened the year I got married. I didn't even think it was going to happen. So people point to that as like a sign that, oh, things have really shifted. And I think in some ways, yes, we're seeing more visibility. Yes, we're seeing people becoming more intentional and centering these conversations and these experiences and identities. Yet other ways, fundamentally, there hasn't been as many changes. The school system, education system, what's provided for folks in terms of in the curriculum and visibility around LGBTQ rights and the movement itself, key figures in those movements. People don't talk about that in school, really, very rarely. Mm-hmm. What is available in the schools for youth to support their exploration of identity. I think we're starting to see schools embrace more youth groups, student groups to support that, but that's still lacking in many areas depending on where you're at. So that kind of support. For our trans and non-binary youth, there are real struggles, especially in terms of inclusivity in space, not just in school, but in other places, of course, as well. So I think we're seeing some of the same challenges play out. Homelessness among youth who are rejected by family, issues with accessing employment, the lack of protections related to that, and other kinds of accommodations. So there are real issues that are still...
Sure. Well, It's kind of the macro and the micro.
It is.
Yeah, we had a black president, but there's still racism.
Yeah, right. That doesn't cure
right.
those institutional things that are impacting our communities.
On the campus, though, the young people you're working with, do you feel like even, let's say, the straight community, do you feel like there's more acceptance there, or is there still kind of a stagnation?
In terms of on campus,
Mm-hmm.
like what I'm seeing at the college
campus.
level? I think that there is a movement towards acceptance and inclusivity. I really do. We have a Pride Center now on campus, which makes me really excited and something I'm very proud of.
Is that brand new?
That's very new. Okay. This is its second year, and it's the first year that the center has a director, so an actual full-time staff person.
So they're actually paying somebody.
They're actually paying someone, right, which means something. If you're going to put money to, and back it up, that really shows your commitment towards it. Mm-hmm. So I actually think that there's movement towards that. I've always been embraced at the university, which it was something I wasn't sure would happen, especially coming from a more urban area to a more rural environment.
And you came here from Philadelphia?
Yeah, that's where I did my graduate studies.
So you were a little nervous about coming out to the farmland.
Oh, totally. Totally. I was like, what am I signing up for? It was definitely a fear. But
then when you got here, you felt, at least on campus, you were accepted and... included?
Yeah, I have a really great department. I'm a social worker, and I landed in a department with folks who are just as passionate about these issues as I am, and were really supportive of my own passions. You don't always get that in social work. There's a kind of a kind of a misunderstanding that all social workers are on the same page with these issues, but even in our profession, they're not always.
Well, you're people. You're going to have the same mix of people.
Right.
Let's talk about some of the work you're doing. Discuss some of the issues that are important to you.
So on campus, a lot of the work that I do with our committee is focused on really creating more inclusive space on campus. Some of the projects that we've taken on include developing and instituting a preferred name policy on campus, which we were successful with and now have. We are working on advocating for more inclusive bathrooms on campus because most bathrooms on our campus right now are very binary. The building I'm in, for example, just has male, female on every floor, and that is not accessible to all communities of folks. It doesn't always feel safe to use a bathroom. So that's a big issue that we're pushing forward. Inclusive housing on campus as well is another thing that we're trying to push for. And then just in general, increasing awareness and education, which is a continuous thing that has to be done.
Let's talk about the pronouns. I noticed in your email signature something I'd never seen before.
Yeah.
You indicated your preferred pronouns.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting. You know, what is kind of the pronoun situation? I don't know how else to frame it really, but...
Yeah. So I do that as a way to extend to others the opportunity for them to share their pronouns. It's an inclusive practice, really. Misgendering and mispronouncing folks is an act of violence. And so it has very significant impacts on trans and non-binary communities.
So when you say that's an act of violence, what I'm hearing is it's an intentional act to not recognize how you want to be identified. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I think that definitely mistakes happen, and there are ways to rectify that if it does. It does not, though, minimize the impact of what happened, right? And I am not completely, perfect with that either. There have been moments where I have misgendered and mispronounced someone. And so, but it is incumbent on me as a cisgender person, meaning non-trans person, to do the work in order to create more inclusive spaces. And I'm trying to do my part. And so by sharing my pronouns, my hope is to be able to do that.
Right. It kind of opens up the dialogue.
Yeah.
What's your preferred pronoun?
Right. And if you are a trans or non-binary person and you see this cisgender person modeling that, it might signal to you, hey, maybe this person gets it. Maybe they're safe. You may or may not still choose to share with me, but at least it gives you a little bit of an indication that, this could be potentially a safe person in a safe space.
Now, that's an interesting concept, looking at the world for safe people and safe places.
Yeah.
So that's basically kind of having to read the map of humanity before you.
Yep.
Let's talk about that a little. I mean, how does that work? I mean, I'm just cisgender, I guess is the term.
Yes.
So I just flow through society. It's kind of effortless.
Yeah.
How does that work for someone who's maybe coming out or kind of more on the cusp and not sure what to do?
Yeah, so I think most folks in the LGBTQ plus communities read or scan space for safety, whether that is related to gender or sexual orientation. Most people are looking for signs that tell them that, hey, this is a place where I can be me. And I even do that. I did that when I was coming here for my interview at Ship, meaning for my job. And, the first thing I did was look on the website, see what I could see what I could learn, which wasn't much at the time, unfortunately. And then during the interview process itself, I was constantly looking for things as simple as a rainbow or a safe zone sticker, something that's telling me okay, these people might get it. The way that they asked questions, the way that they talked to me. And then for me, I put little things out there to see how people respond. So I use the term partner versus husband or wife. And so you can tell a lot when you use that term and how people receive that.
So you're watching people's body language and facial expressions.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And I'm a clinician by training, so then I'm always tuning into people's nonverbals. But yeah, that's a big piece of it.
What does inclusivity look like at its end goal?
I think it's equity and inclusion, right? It's not only having a seat at the table, but it's also being affirmed in terms of what you have to say and what you want to share, right? And not just being dismissed and pushed aside. I think tokenism happens a lot in place of true inclusion and equity. People say, okay, we've got our queer person, we've got our trans, non-binary person, we're good, right? And that's not inclusion or equity. So to me, it really is a deeper, more meaningful commitment.
So let's talk a little bit about your family and their acceptance and the cultural acceptance that happens. Where's your home country, or where your family came from? I'm sorry, that's probably how I should be asking it. Tripping all over this question, sorry.
So I was born in the U.S., but my family and our kind of ethnic culture is Puerto Rican. So most of my was born and raised in Puerto Rico. My father, who still lives in Puerto Rico, and my mom was born in New York, but raised most of her childhood in Puerto Rico. And so in terms of acceptance, right, I think it really is a subjective experience, right? We can't ever fully generalize that all Latinx cultures are homophobic, heterocentric, and transphobic. But there are some real deep-rooted elements of that in our culture. It's not something that is always readily accepted. That has its roots, though, in colonialism in terms of what Catholicism brought to many of those countries that were originally indigenous, right? And had different ideas around sexuality and gender, which was more fluid. So there is that reality. There are definitely ways in which in Puerto Rican culture where trans and non-binary and queer folks are not as accepted, and people experience deep-seated homophobia and transphobia. I was really lucky in the sense with my mother, because she raised us majority of my childhood on her own, that she is not that way, right? She kind of challenged that herself and modeled for us something different. Whereas in some, parts of our culture, people hold these values that really don't. And so I got really lucky in that.
Like
and I did. And I think other spaces, other cultures, other countries, people fare worse than others.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. There's huge differences.
Yeah.
So a part of what you're involved in, non-discrimination policies directed for LGBTQ people. Let's talk about that a little. What's some of your work in that area, and then we can discuss the Supreme Court case.
Yeah. So I'm really lucky that Shippensburg University itself has in their non-discrimination policy protections for LGBTQ plus communities. I think the language could be a little bit stronger, but it's there. So I'm really lucky for that.
What does it say? What protections does it offer?
So it offers language in general in terms of sexual orientation is part of that. Gender, I think if we specifically say trans and non-binary, but I'm not sure when that was drafted, so the language probably wasn't there for that.
Does sexual orientation not cover those groups?
No, because they're different. Sexual orientation is different from gender. So right now what we see, though, is some of the protections that many trans and non-binary folks have that has been linked to sex-based discrimination, right? And like protections against that. Yet that's not even fully accurate. And we're seeing that being contested in many ways. In the state of Pennsylvania, there are very little to none.
There's no statewide protections, but there are specific counties that will have some, some
municipalities.
Yeah, or municipalities.
But not Chambersburg.
Not Chambersburg.
No. And what we actually later this month on October 22nd at the Capitol, the PA Commission for LGBTQ Affairs is actually holding a rally and lobbying day event for folks to come and lobby for more comprehensive non-discrimination legislation, because we don't have any.
It really needs to happen at the state level.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
hard to make it incumbent on the
Yes.
communities.
It needs to happen at the federal level.
Well, yeah.
Well, ideal.
Otherwise, you're going to have the hodgepodge of laws that won't protect these individuals as they travel or move.
Of course. It needs to happen at both those levels, right? Pennsylvania and at the federal. And when you have this like piecemealing of non-discrimination,
it doesn't
like if
work.
I go in this county,
Right.
all right, cool, I'm good, I'm protected if someone fires me or they deny me housing or whatever. But if I then go to this other county where it doesn't, that's problematic. I'm safe at Shippensburg University, but if I step off campus...
Yeah, in Shippensburg Township.
Right. That's not necessarily the same.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real problem in Pennsylvania and in other states as well. And it creates a lot of issues, a lot of fears that are very real for folks.
For people that don't know, what are some of the discriminations that happen?
So I've mentioned a couple, right? Employment is a big one. It's perfectly legal for someone to fire you if there is no non-discrimination policy in place based on sexual orientation and identity and gender. And so that's a real issue that folks face. There's also discrimination that happens in terms of housing. Which is another big one, where folks are denied housing, they won't get callbacks for housing, or be evicted once found out. That's another big piece. There's also discrimination related to denial of services, right?
Sure.
So like what we've seen, so-called religious freedom laws that allow, certain folks to say, if I'm a pharmacist, I'm not going to give you your testosterone or your estrogen, right? Because I don't believe in that.
And what always gets me about those laws, when they say freedom or liberty, they do the exact opposite every single time.
I'm going to restrict you, actually.
So in light of that, we do have this major Supreme Court case coming up. Tell us what you know about that, Lil, and I can fill in information.
Yeah, so this is it's a really big case involving, or has implications in terms of trans and non-binary folks especially, and permitting more discrimination.
The case is called Zarda. The two cases, Zarda and Bostock. Darnold Zarda and Gerald Bostock, gay men who alleged they were fired because of their sexual orientation, versus Harris Funeral Homes involves Amy Stevens, a trans woman who was fired by a boss who claims that he would, quote, violate God's commands if he allowed Stevens to deny her sex while acting as a representative of the organization. So it's very specifically directed at, in this case, a trans person.
Yeah, and implications for the whole community at large, for sure.
Yeah. It actually is contingent upon, this is, I think, pretty interesting, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits gender stereotyping.
Yeah.
Which now, in our modern times, will include these plaintiffs.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very interesting. We'll see what the court has to say.
Right.
But if they go the way they tend to go, this could be a bad day.
This will be a major bad day. It will have really significant repercussions for LGBTQ plus communities in general. Like I said, in terms of if we're taking like the state of Pennsylvania, where many counties don't have these non-discrimination policies in place, some places you can kind of fall on this, like Title VII, as something that you can potentially litigate if you are fired or, denied access to needed services and file that under discrimination using Title VII, which, ACLU or, National Center for Transgender Equality, right, give, visibility to. And so if this happens then, because they're interpreting it to not include trans and non-binary folks and communities, then there are real life implications for that.
Oh, definitely. This will be on the ground implications. If I could just read a very short analysis that I think explains this nicely. The analysis in Harris Funeral Homes, the case involving a trans woman, is even more straightforward. Think about the case from the employer's perspective. The employer believes that Amy Stevens is a man and that Stevens is forbidden to deny her true sex. To keep her job, Stevens must comply with her boss's understanding of how a man should dress and act. But this same boss would not require a female employee to dress like a man and to comply with male gender norms. The boss's rule is that men must dress and act one way and women must dress and act a different way, and that is sex discrimination. Mm-hmm. That's the crux of the argument. Mm-hmm. That will hopefully prevail in court. We'll see. With the way the court's gone these days, you can kind of we can call it, and none of us have a law degree, which is unfortunate.
It's, it speaks to this, obviously transphobia and this idea that trans women are not women and trans men are not men, or those who don't exist within the binary are not as valid or are less than, and this invisibility that exists, and this assumption that there is just two ways of being and expressing who you are, which is just ludicrous, right? It really is, and wasn't always this way. And yet we've come to this point in time where we are just so rigid in our thinking and understanding, when in reality, if we were more fluid, we would see that most folks, they just want to exist. That is literally all they want to do.
I think this happens when you don't have direct interaction with people in that situation, with trans people, with gay people. When you can when you can see them from an abstract distance, you can put all kinds of things on them.
Sure.
But after you meet them and you realize that's a fully formed human being, if you don't change, then there's something not quite right.
Well, then there's some real deep-seated stuff happening. But
I do think that, what we're looking at, and I don't want to overly dramatize it, but to some people, you're upending a social order that they depend on. Mm-hmm. And when you come with these new things and these changes, it's frightening. Yeah.
And I'm like, let's live in the chaos. F social order. Sorry. I mean, that's my thought, right? To me, I think there's beauty in not just diversity, right? Like, and not in a cliche way, but
that's not a bad cliche, though.
No, it's not a bad cliche. But there's a beauty in this, and seeing that there are multiple ways to exist and to express. And if we could let go, we would see so much more kind of happening in our world, right?
How do we get through to people who might consider themselves accepting of the trans community, but they don't necessarily see the problem. They don't see, why do people need special exceptions or special laws to protect them? Well, that's something you run into. Like when we did the thing with the borough to try and get the borough to do a protective law in Shippensburg.
And it wasn't even an enforceable thing. It was more kind of just to
like
say we did it and we're with you.
It seems like one of the biggest hurdles is getting people to understand that there is a problem. Like they may think that they're open-minded, but they don't accept that there's a problem.
Yeah, that's a big issue, right? People who are like, I'm on board, but right? Why do you need this? Yeah. And the reality is again, painting the full picture, because the world that we live in is not just. It just isn't right now. And making it clear the implications when you don't have that. So, for example, at our university, one of the big pieces we're trying to move forward is with the inclusive bathrooms, right? And I would say everyone is on board. They're very supportive. And I am pushing for the fact that we need a statement at minimum that says, when you come onto this campus, you are free to use whatever bathroom you want to use. And there is resistance sometimes to that, and I think it's similar. Well, why do we need that specific language out there? We know, people know that they can, but that's not true, because our realities, people's realities, is rooted in something different. And I think sometimes the way to get through is to share those stories, to really amplify the experiences of those who that is not the case.
Right.
Yeah, it has to be humanized fully in
It
order for
does.
people like on the borough council or wherever to understand that this is a real issue, not just a group looking for a special exemption or a carve out or what have you.
And I really struggle with people's resistance to that anyways, because to me, I'm like, great. We should be accommodating and giving special, exceptions to certain groups, because
And how does it hurt you if we do that?
how does it hurt you? If you already have privilege that is inherent, that nothing's going to be taken away from you.
Well, to play devil's advocate here for a minute, the city of Portland,
Portland.
Portland, always way ahead of the curve, maybe in good ways and bad ways. They just eliminated all urinals, and so now their bathrooms are for both men and women.
Yeah.
And this, to the article I read, brought up some concerns of women, of being in those spaces with men.
Sure.
And so, I don't know if this is a good solution or a bad solution. I don't know, but, that's something I hadn't really thought of. And now that you think of it, a woman might not feel safe going into a bathroom with men.
Sure.
So what does an ideal situation look like, and, how would it work?
So I think all oppression is related and intersects with each other, right? And so I think there are some real valid concerns that people have in terms of safety and past traumas that they might have experienced. I don't think that that's a legitimate excuse then to exclude folks from using bathrooms. And I'm just saying in general, when we have binary bathrooms and folks are like, a trans, woman can't come and use a women's bathroom because I don't feel safe, when in reality what they're saying is a trans woman is not a woman, which she is.
Yeah.
I think that, the more inclusive spaces that we can provide, the better. I think what we're talking about here is a big culture shift that is probably going to take a long time for folks to get used to and actually align with those values. One of the things that we're talking about on campus is, in terms of that same issue, to help kind of address that is, okay, can we offer, and because reality is, in certain fields, in certain departments, the majority of folks in those spaces are women. So can we have an option for women, stalls or bathroom, and also gender inclusive bathrooms on the same floor? And in a way to help offer a space for folks where, maybe using a bathroom with cisgender men, because those are the folks who are most often the ones perpetrating such violence against women, can have that space as well. I think we're talking about real cultural, deep-rooted changes that have to happen before people can start to, because to eliminate that problem, we have to eliminate toxic masculinity, white supremacy, right? We have to eliminate...
Your laundry list is getting big.
Right. We have to eliminate really big issues so women feel safe to use the bathroom in general, right? So that's a big shift that has to happen.
So moving on to another topic, if we could. This is a thorny one, but the intersection of religion and religiosity and the LGBTQ rights movement. I feel like this is where there's the most friction.
Sure.
In your study and in your work, I mean, is there a dialogue that you're trying to create to kind of bridge this gap, or how does it work?
Sure. So I think in some of our communities, this is a real issue and a real challenge. There are definitely folks on the Concerns Committee as well, but also one of the other hats I wear is co-chair of the Council on Social Work Education's Council on Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Expression.
Please tell me there's an acronym for that.
CSOG. It's called CSOG.
We were going to put that in the intro. I took that
It's
out.
a lot. It's a lot. CSOG. But why I bring that up is because a couple of the members on that group, they have really took it upon themselves to try to help bridge those gaps, especially in terms of how do we help folks align and make more inclusive space and understanding within very religious communities. Because the reality is, just because someone is LGBTQ plus does not mean that they are not or cannot be religious as well.
Right.
And so I think there's lots of folks trying to make those movements. There's definitely talk among our committees on campus around how do we start to facilitate conversations with the local community. Again, making this humanistic, right? Person-centered. Here are stories. Trying to make that shift and change.
I think if that can be opened up, I think a lot could change more quickly.
Sure.
I also wanted to say that I have a daughter in high school right now, and from the conversations we have around the dinner table, her generation, as far as her group and most people she knows, they've made the leap. It's kind of like once they mature and come into positions of power, I think the real change will have happened already.
Yeah, I think it's definitely generational. Hate is learned. It is not inherent. I think if we find ways to intervene earlier, sooner. I'm also a sex educator by training too. And so I'm a huge proponent of bringing these topics and ideas, the younger, the better, to talk with young kids around what it means to be LGBTQ+, that it's not a scary thing. It's not a scary topic. And so if we can do that sooner, then that helps embed that message and counters what they might be hearing from older generations or more conservative generations at home and in the community.
Sure. All right, well, that's all the time we have for our show today. I really want to thank you for coming on and doing all your good work.
It was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Dr. Galarza.
I appreciate it.
And thanks, everyone, for listening. Find us online at progresspod.org.